Hello there. UK government debt skyrocketed in November. Public finances are under pressure from rising interest payments, but also from the enormous cost of subsidizing citizens and companies' energy bills. The budget deficit hit £22 billion. That's the highest monthly figure in data going back to 1993. That's what the British Statistics Office said on Wednesday. The financial gap was almost 3 times as high as a year ago. Economists had expected a deficit of 14.8 billion, so much lower. Until recently, UK borrowing was falling as the recovery from the pandemic boosted tax revenues and reduced coronavirus-related spending. Meanwhile, Treasury officials in London are forecasting the 2022-23 deficit to be the second highest in a decade. Chancellor of the Exchequer, or Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt, blamed Russia's attack on the Ukraine for the spike in energy costs. "We have taken important steps to support millions of businesses and families here in the UK," said Hunt. "We have a clear plan to halve inflation next year, but that will require some tough decisions to put our public finances back on sustainable footing." And otherwise, things are not going well in Britain as well. In the face of a strike by ambulance drivers, the British Health Service NHS has called on the population to avoid all emergency risks. "People can help by taking sensible steps to protect themselves and others at this time and not to end up in the emergency room," said Stephen Powers, NHS Medical Director in England. This includes drinking alcohol responsibly, looking out for family members or neighbours, and stocking up on medication. Secretary of State Will Quince had previously warned against contact sports and risky activities. I mentioned that before. A total of around 25,000 ambulance workers in England and Wales walked out on Wednesday. They demand higher wages and, what's even more important, better working conditions. Several hundred soldiers step in, but only for patient transport and not for emergencies. And another strike is planned for December 28th. Already on December 15th and 20th, tens of thousands of NHS nurses and hospital staff went on strike. And meanwhile, Britain's Health Secretary Steve Barclay is making serious allegations against the unions. Unions made a conscious choice to harm patients. That's what Barclay wrote in an op-ed for the Telegraph newspaper on Wednesday. The NHS Health Service emergency plan stated that not all emergency calls would be covered, Barclay claimed. The unions have criticized the Conservative politician's statement as misleading and, in the worst case, deliberate scaremongering. A final attempt to negotiate with the ambulance drivers failed on Tuesday. Barclay refuses to discuss higher wages than the offered 4% increase. Union General Secretary Christina McNear said the government was behaving completely irresponsibly. Possible deaths due to the strike are the sole fault of Downing Street. The trade unions criticize a significant drop in real wages in the coming years and are now demanding an increase well above the current inflation rate of around 11%. And with consumer prices rising and poverty growing, even the food banks in the UK say they are experiencing the greatest demand in their history. This is the busiest time independent food banks have ever experienced in Britain, and many are struggling with the growing demand, said Sabine Goodwin, head of the umbrella organization Independent Food Aid Network, to the German press agency. "It's becoming clearer than ever that charitable assistance as a response to escalating poverty is neither sustainable nor acceptable," said Goodwin. "Rather, people need support payments and wages with which they can pay for food themselves and for their families." Inflation in Great Britain was, as I said, recently around 11%, limited to food even higher. The UK economy is in recession and has barely recovered from the pandemic low compared to other countries. And Brexit has drastically reduced trade with the largest market on the doorstep, the European Union. The Conservative British government actually took office at the beginning of the legislature with a promise of levelling up. That means adjusting living conditions in all parts of the country upwards. But little has happened since then. In the north of England in particular, many regions have been left behind and child poverty is high. The situation has worsened as a result of the Ukraine war, but the Ukraine war was not the initial reason. According to the Trussell Trust, which owns 1,300 food banks across the UK, more than 1.3 million emergency food parcels have already been distributed from April to September this year. That's a third more than in the same period last year, and half times the previous figures of the pandemic. In addition, 320,000 people turned to the food banks for the first time in the first 6 months, and that's 40% more than in the same period in 21. Storing and refrigerating donated food is a problem for some food banks as it limits their capacity to donate. King Charles III has made a major donation with one of his foundations, which is intended to fund at least 800 refrigerators and freezers for food banks and similar facilities. Organizations had previously reported that in recent years, food donations around Christmas have sometimes had to be turned down because they could not have been refrigerated. And that is a picture that we all unfortunately have kind of expected. But they are still denying the big part of this and the big part of the role that Brexit plays. I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.